"Sign the papers," Daniel said, and the words cut through me sharper than any blade. He was 34 years old, my only son, dressed in a tailored suit I had paid for, standing in the dining room of the house I had built, and he was looking at me as if I were an obstacle to be removed. His hand pushed a folder across the oak table. Transfer of ownership. Miller Freight, the company I had carved out of nothing but sweat, sleepless nights, and a single used truck reduced to lines on a document waiting for my signature. Dad, you are the past. I am the future. I stared at him, trying to see the boy who used to climb into my lap after Little League games, the boy who begged me to let him steer the truck down back roads. All I saw was a man with ambition burning so hot it had turned to greed. Linda's voice followed, smooth and sharp. She was 58, still polished pearls, gleaming makeup perfect. Once she had been my anchor. Now her words felt like stones thrown into a grave. Thomas, you are tired. You are slipping. Do not cling to what you cannot control anymore. Step aside with dignity before you drag us all down. My chest tightened. I looked to Rebecca. She sat rigid, 29 years old, brilliant, quiet, always my gentle one. Tonight, her face was unreadable. She avoided my eyes, her silence louder than any insult. I pushed the papers back across the table. No. Daniel's jaw tightened, his smirk replaced by something harder. We are not asking. We are telling you. Sign them and you will live comfortably. We will give you an allowance. Allowance. The words stung like acid. I had spent decades putting food on this table, paying for every education, every house, every trip, every luxury. And now my own son wanted to put me on an allowance like some old man who had outlived his usefulness. I rose from my chair. I will not sign away my life to feed your greed. Daniel slammed his fist on the table, silverware clattering, water glasses trembling. You are pathetic. You never understood how to move forward. I am the future of this company. Linda leaned forward, her voice sharp but steady. Think of your reputation, Thomas. People already whisper about your health. If you keep fighting, you will only humiliate yourself and this family. My health. I had carried this business on my shoulders through recessions, through endless nights, through the kind of pressure that would have broken most men. At 62, I was still sharp, still strong, still working circles around men half my age. Yet my wife, the woman who once swore to stand by me, sat there feeding the lie that I was finished. I looked at Rebecca again. My daughter did not move. Her eyes finally met mine and then slid away. No loyalty. No defense, just cold detachment. My voice broke, but I forced it out. Everything you are comes from me. Every opportunity, every dollar, every door opened. And you treat me like this. Daniel moved around the table. His shoulders squared, his hands balled into fists. If you will not hand it over willingly, then you no longer belong here. My heart sank. Belong. In my own home. The house I had bought brick by brick, where we had strung lights for Christmas, where I had read bedtime stories, where we had celebrated birthdays with laughter echoing through these halls. Daniel grabbed my arm, fingers digging hard into my skin. He pulled me from the chair. You are finished. I fought to hold my ground. Daniel, stop this madness. I am your father. He yanked the front door open and shoved me into the night. The air was heavy with the smell of cut grass and rain. You stopped being my father when you chose your pride over your family. The words struck harder than the shove. My knees buckled, but I caught myself on the railing. My suitcase landed at my feet with a dull thud. Already packed. Already waiting. They had planned this. This was no heat of the moment. Linda stood in the doorway, her face composed, her eyes cold. "Do not come back until you are ready to do what is right." The door slammed. The lock clicked. The sound echoed through my bones like a sentence being handed down. I bent to pick up the suitcase. My hand trembled as I gripped the handle. The porch light above me buzzed faintly, casting long shadows across the yard. I looked back once, hoping for a crack in the door, for Rebecca to appear, for someone to show mercy. Nothing. Only silence. I stepped down the wooden steps, each one heavier than the last. The gravel crunched under my shoes as I walked to the gate. Behind me, the windows glowed with warm light, the life I had built with my own hands. A life I was no longer part of. At the gate, I stopped, my breath fogging in the cool night air. My chest burned with fury, grief, and something else I could not yet name. I turned back one last time. No one was watching. No one cared. I walked into the darkness, the suitcase dragging behind me, and with every step I knew the truth. My family had cast me out, and I had nothing left but the bitter promise that this was not the end. It was only the beginning. The road out of Preston Hollow was empty and wet, and the streetlights swam in the puddles like tired eyes. I kept driving until the houses thinned into strip malls, and the strip malls gave way to warehouses and gas stations. I turned in, parked under a cypress tree, and sat with the engine off until the silence folded over me. I wrote Thomas Miller, left the address line blank, and paid for one night in cash. I set the suitcase on the chair and opened it. No photos, no keepsakes, nothing that said I had ever been a father or a husband. The hum of the air unit pulled me backward through time. I closed my eyes, and I was back in 1985, standing in a gravel lot on the south side of Dallas, staring at a 12-year-old International truck with flaking paint and a stubborn engine. I had $3,000 to my name, and a promise I had made to myself that I would never again let another man decide whether I worked or went home. I put my hand on the fender and felt heat from the last run. She would carry my life. I drove that truck myself for the first 6 months. I slept in the cab under a wool blanket and woke when the sun slipped up behind the tanks and rooftops. The road asked for everything and then paid me in miles. Linda packed sandwiches in wax paper and kept the books on a legal pad. When Daniel was born, I held him in my arms, and he grabbed my finger with a grip that amazed me. I promised him a future he would not have to beg for. When Rebecca came 5 years later, Linda laughed and cried at the same time. The sacrifices came, and I made them without asking for applause. My father left me a small plot in Ellis County. Nothing fancy, a few acres and an old pecan tree. I sold it without blinking when Daniel got his letter from the University of Texas. Tuition was due and the truck fleet needed a new transmission. For Rebecca, when she said she wanted law school, I nodded and took out a second loan. SMU would open doors, she said. I believed her, and I believed in her. Somewhere along the line, the numbers got bigger and the rooms got quieter. Then we added a second warehouse and a dispatch office and a line of trucks in our colors gleaming in the morning. Linda stopped keeping the books on a legal pad and started dressing for lunches where everyone knew each other's net worth. The parties changed her smile. She started mentioning what other men had done for their wives. I told myself it was fine, that she had earned nice things, that it would pass. Years have a way of telling the truth that moments cannot. The more we had, the more I worked, and the more I worked, the more the house felt like a hotel where I was a frequent guest. I sat on the motel bed and felt the springs answer me. I wondered when exactly Linda's eyes had stopped softening when I walked in. I wondered when Daniel had turned admiration into contempt. I wondered how long Rebecca had practiced that silence. Rain began to tap at the window. A siren faded somewhere beyond the freeway. My phone sat face down on the nightstand. I did not want to see any names on that screen. Not tonight. I went to the sink, ran the water until it turned from brown to clear, and splashed my face. The mirror over the vanity gave me back a man I knew and did not know. The hair thinner, the lines deeper, but the eyes were still mine. Tired, yes, but not gone. Not yet. I thought about the land I had sold, the loans I had taken, the long nights I had driven, while Linda slept in a warm bed, and the kids dreamed of futures I had sworn to make real. I thought about the speech I would have given Daniel if he had been a stranger asking me for a job. Work hard, show up early, respect what built the place you want to run. He had learned other lessons somewhere else. The room felt smaller with every breath. I needed a voice that was not mine. I scrolled to Mark Johnson and stared at the name. Mark had been with me since the second warehouse. He had rewritten supplier contracts, kept us out of one ugly lawsuit with a vendor who wanted to double bill, and once drove across town on a Sunday to hand-deliver a letter I needed for a bank meeting Monday morning. He turned 65 last winter and toasted the company with a grin like a kid. I hit call and sat on the edge of the bed while it rang. He picked up on the third ring, his voice steady and warm even through the static. "Thomas, it is late. Are you all right?" I opened my mouth and nothing came out. The shame sat heavy in my chest, heavier than the suitcase, heavier than the slammed door. I forced the words out one at a time. "Mark, I am at a motel off Northwest Highway. I am fine, but I am not all right. The house is closed to me. The company is under attack. They pushed papers at me, and when I refused, they put me outside." I paused, swallowed, and finished the sentence I had been avoiding. "I have lost my family." Mark did not rush to fill the quiet. He let it sit there with me, and somehow that helped. Then his voice found a rhythm I recognized. "Come to my office in the morning. We will sort through what can be done. You are not alone in this. Do you have cash? Do you have your identification? Is your phone secure?" I answered yes and yes and yes. My voice steadied. "Thank you. I will be there at 8. After the call, the room felt a fraction larger. I turned off the lamp and lay back in the dark, listening to the air unit grind and the rain sift against the glass. My mind walked the old roads again, the miles, the small victories, the mornings when nothing was certain except the work in front of me. I had survived worse than cold rooms and locked doors. I could survive this. Sleep came in fits. I dreamed of the yard at dawn, the trucks lined up like loyal soldiers, the smell of diesel and coffee. Maria from dispatch laughing as she handed me a clipboard. I woke before the alarm and sat up with a clarity that surprised me. The road calls to those who know it, and even when you are not behind the wheel, you learn to keep moving. I dressed, tied my shoes, and put the key card on the nightstand. In the mirror, I straightened my collar the way Linda used to do before a banquet. The memory flickered and passed. I picked up the suitcase and stepped into the pale gray morning. The rain had stopped. The lot gleamed and the air tasted new. I walked to the truck, started the engine, and let it idle while the heater shook off the damp. I had a place to be and a man to see, and for the first time since the door had shut behind me, I felt the faint outline of a way forward. Morning light bled across the edge of the parking lot, and the heater in my truck finally chased the damp from the windshield. I pulled onto Northwest Highway and let the city wake around me. The world kept moving as if nothing had happened the night before. Memory dragged me back to the dining room, where the first crack had sounded loud enough to split the house. I set my fork down before I asked the question, "What does this one do?" I looked at my son and felt a tide climb into my chest. The old guard he wanted to undercut was me. Miller Freight was not a museum piece. We had already adopted route optimization, already moved to digital bills of lading, already trimmed fat where it hid. He spoke as if we had been asleep while the world ran past. Ideas without discipline rot, I told him. If you want to build, build with numbers that add up, with people who show up with promises you can keep. You do not understand this generation, Daniel shot back. We do not wait for permission. We move. We break things so we can make them better. I turned to Rebecca. Process does not excuse recklessness. Your brother is not jumping. He is spending other people's money to see how far he can fall. Thomas Linda said, "Let him try. The world is different now. Your way worked then. His way will work now." My jaw ached from holding back what I wanted to say. My way was waking before dawn to load pallets by hand when the forklift refused to start. My way was pushing a truck with a dead alternator across a parking yard while a storm crawled over the horizon. My way was taking every call, every complaint, every late delivery and turning them into a reason to do better. If that was obsolete, then the ground under my feet had changed to sand, and none of us had noticed. She returned from the kitchen, and for a second, the screen of her phone lit with a name. David Collins. A small chill walked up my spine. David had been my deputy for 5 years. He was sharp and tireless and ambitious in a way that made me keep him close. Daniel outlined timelines and projections he could not possibly have finished without help. I chewed without tasting and kept my mouth shut because sometimes silence keeps a family from burning down in one night. The light turned green on Northwest Highway, and I eased through the intersection. Mark's office was 10 minutes away if traffic stayed kind. My phone buzzed on the console. A news alert crawled across the screen. Rumors circulate regarding Thomas Miller's health and leadership. Sources allege confusion in recent meetings and concern among senior staff. I pulled into a grocery lot and parked between 2 empty spaces. I opened the article. Anonymous sources. Unnamed executives. Words like decline and stability risk and succession urgency. I knew the shape of that kind of story. I scrolled and found a line that curdled my stomach. Family members close to Miller expressed concern that he is no longer capable of guiding the company through an increasingly complex market. The word family did not mean Linda or Rebecca had spoken on the record. It meant Daniel had been busy. I closed my eyes and saw another night at that same table long after the plates had been cleared. Daniel paced while he talked the way he does when his pitch is more performance than plan. He said he could roll his new company into Miller Freight when it hit stride. He said I would thank him for the vision. I told him to build something that could stand on its own weight first. He laughed, and his laughter was a polished blade. From the hall, Linda's voice softened. "David," she said, and nothing after that, except the hush of breath and a door closing further down the corridor. When she came back, she had that distant brightness in her eyes that she used to reserve for me. A man does not want to be the last to understand his own life. It is a special kind of humiliation to feel the shape of something wrong and be unable to name it yet. I did not accuse. I did not confront. I told myself it was business. Calls happen at odd hours. I swallowed that bitter thing because sometimes pride is a bridge you walk across only once. Back in the grocery lot, I watched 2 employees chase a runaway cart and laughed once, a small sound that did not mean amusement. I called the yard and asked for Marisol in dispatch. She hesitated and then told me that 2 vendors had called to confirm changes to standing agreements that I had not authorized. She had stalled them, said she needed signatures. The revisions lowered our rates in ways that would look generous to customers and murderous to our margins. I thanked her, told her to lock down everything until she heard from me directly, and ended the call with a gratitude that left me a little unsteady. Someone inside was loosening bolts that should not be touched. I did not have to guess who had suggested it. Traffic thickened as I pulled back onto the road. Mark's building rose out of the low offices like a promise. On the way there, I passed the coffee shop where I had once signed a deal that kept our fleet alive during a dry season. The memory came with the smell of burnt beans and the sound of a barista calling my name wrong. I had laughed then. It felt like another lifetime. I parked and turned off the engine and let the quiet settle. Through the glass doors, I could see Mark's receptionist leaning over a calendar, a stack of files balanced on her forearm. My phone buzzed again. Another alert. A financial blog had picked up the same rumor and added a speculation that Miller Freight might be exploring leadership changes to stabilize operations. That word stabilize told me the story had help. Words like that do not happen by accident. They are planted. I sat for a long breath and watched my reflection in the dark screen. The man looking back at me had not vanished in the night. He was worn, yes, and bruised in places no one could see, but he was still here. Every mile, every invoice, every early morning that I had thought would kill me had in fact built a spine that could hold a storm. The family I had carried had set me down hard. The company I had built was being loosened by careful fingers. But I was not finished. I opened the door, and the cold air reached in and found my cheeks. I gathered my papers, locked the truck, and started toward the entrance. Each step steadied me. Each step narrowed the noise in my head to something clean. By the time my hand touched the brass handle, the scattered pieces of the past had arranged themselves into a single line I could follow. The door swung open, and the receptionist looked up from a calendar. "Mark is expecting you. Down the hall, last door on the left." I knocked once and stepped in. Mark stood from behind his desk, gray hair a little wilder than usual. He crossed the room and gripped my shoulder the way a coach does when he means to steady you. "Sit and tell me what happened." "Daniel tried to force a transfer," I said. Linda stood with him. Rebecca watched and did nothing. When I refused, they put me out of my own house. He is also seeding the press with stories about my health. Anonymous sources. Stability and succession. The kind of rot that spreads fast. Mark listened. When I finished, he nodded once slow, like he had been expecting bad news, but not this bad. "First things first," he said. "You remember the structure we built last year? The Living Trust. You signed it at my office with 2 witnesses. We had your primary care doctor and a neurologist sign capacity evaluations the same week. The shares of Miller Freight were retitled into the trust. Your house in Preston Hollow as well. The operating company is managed by the trust, and you are the trustee. Contesting any of this would be an uphill climb for them." I let out a breath I did not know I was holding. That protects the company. It does not protect what they are doing to my name. Mark nodded. Reputation can be attacked faster than it can be repaired. But the law does not ignore lies. If they cross certain lines, we have remedies. He slid a folder toward me. Inside were copies of the trust certificate, the capacity letters, and a checklist I remembered building the day we signed. He leaned back. "We also need to lock down your financial perimeter. Call Marisol in dispatch and tell her no vendor changes, no rate alterations, no new payment instructions whatsoever without your direct written approval. I will send a hold notice to accounting to preserve emails and logs." I told him about the vendors Marisol had already flagged. Mark wrote quickly, then looked up. "Good. We will send letters this morning to rescind any unauthorized revisions. We will also notify the bank to require dual authorization for wires. Tell me about David Collins. My jaw tightened. Operations chief. Smart. Eager to be seen. Linda has been taking calls with him after hours. I do not want to accuse without proof, but there is smoke. I will have a third-party audit a slice of operations for 2 quarters. Quietly. We only need a whiff to justify a full review. Meanwhile, you keep your head. Do not walk into the office alone. Do not sign anything. If they call a board meeting, we attend with counsel and with the trust documents in hand. I know that is not what hurts most, he said. You know the company is insulated. What they tried to take from you last night was not a title. It was your dignity. For 35 years, I had walked into my house knowing that whatever happened out there inside, I was a husband and a father. Last night, I was a trespasser. My voice came out raw. I can fight for the company. I can fight for the contracts. I do not know how to fight for my name with my own children, standing on the other side. Mark folded his hands. You do it the same way you built the business. One verified fact at a time. You do not swing at shadows. You do not wrestle rumors. You bring light. If they have been telling people you are unfit, we will show your last 2 years of board minutes, the strategic memos you wrote, the signed approvals that carried the hardest decisions. We will show the physician letters, and if we must, we will show the video we recorded the day you executed the trust. I looked at him. I had forgotten the camera. I had felt foolish that day speaking to a lens about why I was protecting the company from internal pressure, like a man preparing for a storm he hoped would never come. Mark stood and walked to a cabinet. He unlocked a drawer and came back with a small black drive, no label, no logo. If the day ever comes when you need to make your case in one room, you will need this. It has the trust certificate, the capacity evaluations, the board minutes that matter, your recorded statement, and a short summary I wrote for a judge who might need a map. Keep it on you. Keep it safe. I reached for it and felt the weight of it in my palm, very little, and somehow more than I could carry. We are not finished, Mark said. There is one more piece. We need to speak to people who will stand as character witnesses if this turns into something public. Not friends who will say you are a good man, but colleagues who can say you read the numbers, asked hard questions, and made sound decisions. The banker from the refinancing 2 years ago. The union rep you negotiated with during the warehouse expansion. And the supplier you salvaged when his trucks were impounded at the border. I nodded. Names lined up in my mind like trailers in a yard. The thought of calling them did not shame me. It reminded me that respect is a currency earned in small bills over many years. Mark checked his watch. I have a hearing at 11, but I will have letters out before I leave. The first order of business is to stop the bleeding and show that the heart is still strong. Eat something today that is not from a vending machine. And Thomas, call me before you do anything that feels like justice in the moment. We will aim for justice that holds. I stood and slipped the drive into the inside pocket of my jacket and buttoned it shut. The fabric felt heavier on that side. I shook his hand and felt the old steadiness between our fingers, the kind that comes from standing shoulder to shoulder when the wind turns ugly. At the door, I turned back. Thank you, I said, for building the walls before the storm. We only built the frame, he said. You are the one who kept the roof on all these years. Outside, the air was cool and moving clouds blowing east with the last of the morning wind. I walked to the truck, unlocked it, and sat with both hands on the wheel. The drive was a small weight against my chest. Across the lot, a woman held a toddler's hand and crossed carefully between cars, her head bent to listen, as he told her something only he thought important. There was a house that did not want me, and a company that needed me to be smarter than my pain. There was also a place I could go where the locks were mine, and the walls could still hear my name without flinching. I started the engine, and pulled into the traffic, the city opening ahead of me like a road I had driven for years, but was seeing new again. The toll road curved north. I left the freeway at a quiet exit and followed a 2-lane road. The gate to the Cedar Ridge property rose out of the trees, black iron, with the initials I had once thought would outlast every storm. My code still worked. The motor hummed, the gates swung wide, and the long drive lifted me toward the house that had been both sanctuary and museum to a life I had built with my hands. Maria opened the front door before I reached the porch. She was 55, small and sturdy, her dark hair threaded with silver. "Thomas," she said, and there was a kind of quiet relief in the way she said my name, as if she had been holding her breath since yesterday. I stepped inside and the house met me with the smell of lemon oil and clean linen. Everything was in its place. Maria took my jacket and hung it where it had always waited. "Coffee?" she asked. I nodded. The long windows faced the back lawn and the pecan trees that splayed like hands against the winter sky. I told her the short version. The table, the folder, the shove into the night. The part where my son used the word finished like a verdict. The part where Linda stood in the doorway and told me not to return until I did what was right, as if she owned the definition. Maria listened with her hands around her own mug. When I finished, she said that she was sorry, and that it was wrong, and then she took a breath that carried weight and said there was something I needed to see. She led me down the hall past the study and the piano room, and into a door most guests never noticed. Stairs dropped to a cool space 2 steps below ground, a room with cabinet racks and tidy coils of cable. I had installed the upgraded system last year after a neighbor 3 properties over had their pool house cleaned out while they were at a charity gala. Cameras covered the perimeter and the rooms that mattered. Maria had access to the viewer because I wanted someone on site to be able to check feeds when I was away. She woke the monitor and entered a code. The screen lit with a grid of thumbnails. The date made me pause. It was the evening after my mother's funeral. I had gone to bed early with a headache that felt like a fist. Maria said that after the last guest left, she had locked up and gone to her apartment above the garage. She clicked the first clip. The view came from the study doorway. At timestamp 7:32 in the evening, Linda eased into the frame with a scarf wrapped around her hair. Daniel followed carrying a small duffel. He closed the door and locked it. Then they crossed to the desk. I felt my throat tighten. In the video, Linda went straight to the drawer where I keep personal files. Daniel lifted the painting that conceals a wall safe, then stepped aside while Linda tapped the keypad. The door swung, the interior light popped on, and there it was. A cedar box that had belonged to my mother, a small stack of documents, a velvet pouch with the heavy chain my father wore on Sundays. Linda took the pouch and put it in the duffel. I found myself stepping closer to the screen, as if I could step into the room and stop them. She moved to the next clip. This one showed the upstairs hall. At 7:50, Linda and Daniel opened the small safe in the linen closet. More jewelry, a pocket watch with an engraving my mother had read out loud to me every Christmas Eve, 3 sealed letters my mother had left for Christmases after she was gone. Linda put them all in the bag. They left by the side stairs that lead to the garage. I could not breathe for a few seconds. They had walked through my mother's things within hours of standing over her grave. What did they take besides jewelry? I asked. A thin ledger my mother kept from the early years when we tracked every gallon of diesel and every tire replaced. The velvet pouch with your father's chain and the pocket watch. 2 of the letters your mother sealed for you. They left the documents you moved to the lawyer last year. Thank God you did that when you did. I asked why she had not called me that night. You had just buried your mother, she said. I saved the clips to 2 drives and put one in a safe place. When last night happened, I knew the time had come. She reached into the bottom drawer of the desk against the wall and pulled out a small hard drive in a clear plastic case. She placed it in my hand. I asked if she had told anyone. She shook her head. Only Robert from the grounds crew knew the cameras had been upgraded, and I trusted him, she said. When Linda asked him for gate codes last week, he told her he would need my approval. She accused him of forgetting who paid him. I told Maria she had done exactly right. She said she was sorry she could not stop them. I told her it was not her job to fight a war in a hallway. We went upstairs to the study. I sat in the leather chair and let the room wrap around me. The desk, the lamp, the framed photo of my mother under the pecan tree. Maria stood in the doorway the way she used to when the children were small and came in to say goodnight. I slid the drive into my jacket next to the one Mark had given me. 2 small rectangles, 2 different kinds of defense. I booted the study computer, logged in, and pulled the clips to the desktop. I made a second copy to a new drive from the drawer. Maria said there is one more thing. She walked to the bookcase and pulled a decorative box I had never cared about. Inside lay the sealed letter my mother wrote for the first Christmas after she passed. Maria said she found it tucked under the edge of the rug this morning by the linen closet safe. She handed it to me with both hands. My name sat on the front in my mother's careful handwriting. I stared at it and felt the floor tilt. I did not open it. Not then. I slid the letter into the center drawer and closed it gently. Maria asked what I wanted her to do. I told her to change the gate code and have Robert rekey the side doors by noon. I told her to call the alarm company and restrict all codes except hers and mine and Robert's. I told her to keep the staff schedule tight and to let me know if anyone she did not recognize asked to enter. We stood in the quiet that follows a plan. I looked out across the lawn where the pecan leaves rattled in a light wind. The house did not feel like a hotel today. It felt like a witness. My right hand tightened until the knuckles went white. I had let them walk too far into my life, too far into the rooms where memory lived. I had explained away small trespasses until they believed the whole estate was theirs to plunder. I heard my own voice in the hush, and it sounded like something new. I said that I had let them go too far. Maria did not answer. She did not need to. She understood that something had shifted. I picked up the second drive, slipped it into my pocket, and stood. The list in my head settled into order. Mark would need the footage. The bank would need to hear about gate codes and access lists. And there was a newsroom that would soon receive a different kind of story than the one it had been fed. I thanked Maria. She squeezed my arm the way a mother steadies a son before he steps onto a stage. Downstairs, the air was cooler. I walked past the humming security rack and back into the foyer, where the front door stood open to the crisp day. I took a breath that filled my lungs all the way up. Then I stepped outside the house at my back, and the road waiting beyond the gate. Traffic bled south toward the city, and I let it carry me as far as Oak Lawn before hunger and habit turned the wheel. The diner on Lemon had seen me through lean years and loud ones. A waitress who had worked there since my first warehouse set a mug in front of me without asking and said she was glad to see me. My phone buzzed, and I looked down at a name I did not expect. An old friend from the chamber. He asked if I had a minute. I stepped outside under the faded awning where the morning sun bounced off windshields. He told me a rumor was moving fast. People were saying I had lost a step. Rebecca. She had been at a meet and greet with a few young attorneys the night before, and someone had leaned close to him later and repeated her words. Concern about father's memory. Concerns about recent meetings. You should know, he said. Back at the counter, my eggs had gone lukewarm. My name popped out of the crawl and my heart tripped. A quick swipe brought up the story on my phone, by John Stevens, a reporter who had once covered our charity drives with cheerful paragraphs. The headline asked if the Texas trucking magnate was still fit to lead. The body played careful. Anonymous sources within the company. Concerns about confusion. A recent mistake involving a vendor contract. I read it twice to make sure I was not imagining the shape of it. It was crafted to look like concern, not attack. It was built to invite more people to say the same thing until the saying made it true. The waitress asked if everything was all right, and I heard my voice tell her it was just business. I drove through streets I knew by memory, past warehouses I had once used as staging points, past a church where I had watched my children sing in Christmas pageants. I took the long way through Preston Hollow, even though I knew I did not belong on those streets today. A couple pushing a stroller crossed in front of me, and the woman glanced into my truck. The man looked back over his elbow with an expression that mixed curiosity and pity. I kept my eyes on the road and drove by the house without slowing. The gate looked the same as always. The person I had been when I had the code did not. I needed to feel like a person who could still walk into a room that was not hostile. The community center on Royal Lane held a monthly meeting for business owners and neighborhood leaders. I had attended on and off for years sometimes, to hear about zoning or flood plans, sometimes to shake hands with the police captain and ask about break-ins near our yards. Today the parking lot was already full. I parked on the street and walked in with my shoulders back and my chin level. Folding chairs faced a long table where 3 volunteers arranged agendas. A cluster of shop owners stood near the donuts. A woman in a red cardigan I knew from the food pantry smiled at me with kindness and then looked away quickly. A man from a landscaping company nodded and then studied his shoes. I took a seat in the second row. I had spoken in this room enough times to know the shape of the hour. Announcements, a presentation about new traffic patterns, open floor for comments. I sipped bad coffee and waited for the part where I would stand and talk about hiring fares or supply chain headaches. John Stevens walked in with a small notebook tucked into his back pocket. He greeted the volunteers, then scanned the room. He gave me a small nod that could have meant anything. I did not nod back. The chair called the meeting to order and read through items in a brisk voice. When she opened the floor for comments on business climate, the man from the landscaping company stood and talked about fuel prices and the way rain had ruined spring plantings. A baker talked about ingredient costs. A woman who ran a dance studio asked about permits for sidewalk signage. Then my hand went up as it always had. The chair looked at me. She hesitated, then said we had a full agenda and asked if I could keep it brief. I stood. My name carries weight in rooms like this, even when that weight is shifted by rumors. A few heads turned. I began with what I came to say. I thanked the volunteers. I said the city had to do better with road repairs near warehouse corridors, that the patchwork on Stemmons was costing all of us money in broken shocks and late deliveries. I kept my voice even and my notes short. I had not spoken for 60 seconds when a hand rose in the back, and another and another. The chair interrupted me and said there were concerns to address before we continued. A man I had seen only once before cleared his throat and said he had read a piece that morning about leadership stability at my company. He asked with exaggerated politeness if I felt that I was the best person to speak on corridors and repairs, given the questions on the table. Another person added that the community valued hearing from business leaders who could give clear information. Heat rose up my neck. I said I was happy to answer any questions about roads and costs and that my company had the data to make the case. I said the rumor mill would grind anything you fed it, and that we had all been the subject of stories that took a little truth and stretched it into a lie. I kept my voice level. It did not matter. "Mr. Miller," she said, "perhaps today is not the day for you to address the room. Given the circumstances, it might be best if you take a seat and allow others to speak. We can revisit your input at a later time." A few people exhaled at once. John Stevens shifted his weight against the back wall and scribbled something, then looked up as if to gauge whether I would explode or fold. I stood very still. For decades, I had walked into rooms and had my hand shaken before I reached the second chair. For decades, my voice had been called on when trucks jackknifed in a storm and the city needed alternate routes by nightfall. I thanked the chair for her time and sat down. My heart thudded in my ears so loudly, the next two speakers sounded like they were underwater. A man to my left whispered that it was probably for the best. I stared at the agenda in my lap, as if it could become a shield. The paper did not care about me one way or the other. When the meeting ended, I stood with care and walked out without looking at anyone. John Stevens waited by the water fountain. He said my name and I kept walking. He stepped in front of me and asked if I had a comment on the health of the company. I looked at him and saw a man who had a job to do and a deadline to meet, and a belief that stories are puzzles to be assembled from whatever pieces are available. I told him he would get facts when facts were ready. He said he hoped I would speak on the record soon. I said I hoped he would print correct information when I did. The air outside felt cool and neutral. Cars idled while people compared calendars and gossip. I walked to my truck, unlocked it, and sat with both hands on the wheel. In the side mirror, I watched the door open and close as the room let people go one by one. I sat with it and let it fade just enough to breathe. Then I reached for the notebook in the glove compartment and wrote down 3 lines. Names of people I needed to call. The bank vice president. The union rep. The supplier we pulled through a border nightmare. People who had watched me think with clarity when it counted. I closed the notebook and stared through the windshield at the brick wall ahead. The wall did not move. The feeling in my chest did. It tightened into something that felt like purpose. I turned the key and the engine woke with a familiar shiver. The road would not care about rumors. The work would not either. It was time to trade whispers for proof and proof for action. I started with a list and a steering wheel. George picked up on the second ring and said my name with the steadiness of a man who had kept my ledgers clean since the second warehouse. I asked if he could meet within the hour. I called Robert next. He answered with the hum of a mower in the background and said he would shut it down and be there in 20. Maria was already at the house. I left a brief message for Edward Hayes, and he returned the call while I was turning into the drive. He said he had time this afternoon and that he would come without a robe but with the same respect for evidence. Maria had the door open before I knocked. She told me the locksmith had finished the side doors and that the alarm company had confirmed the new codes. George set his briefcase on the desk and took a breath that looked like a prayer. He opened the case and lifted out 2 binders and a laptop. He said we would start with the general ledger for the last 8 quarters and then look at the vendor contract log, especially the entries Marisol had flagged. He talked while his fingers moved. "We keep our books so that a blind man could follow them," he said. "Clean entries, proper approvals, digital time stamps, every jar labeled." He showed me the email trail for 2 attempted vendor amendments. Both had come from a domain that looked like ours, until the second S in logistics vanished if you blinked. He had already drafted notices to rescind and had queued them to send with my go signal. Robert set a small black case on the desk and opened it to reveal a portable drive and a printout of timestamps. He said that the perimeter cameras had nothing but deer wind and the occasional delivery van. The interior clips were clearer. Mrs. Miller and Daniel entered the study after the funeral at 7:32. They removed items from the safe and from the linen closet. He pushed the drive across the desk and said the files were mirrored in the secure rack and on a second device in his truck. Maria came in then with a leather folder that used to live in my mother's nightstand. She said that after we had watched the clips, she had gone through the best hide places in the house and found this in the linen closet behind a stack of pillowcases. The folder held 3 journals each with the year written on the cover in my mother's careful hand. She had kept ledgers for diesel and tires in the early days. I should have known she would also keep ledgers for the human heart. We opened the first book and read in quiet. She had noted the day we signed the loan to buy the second truck. She had written about the night a storm took the roof off the first warehouse and how we slept on canvas cots on the office floor to keep watch for looters. "He can be stubborn," she wrote, "but he turns stubbornness into endurance when it counts." There was a page about Daniel at 6 with a fever and how I took him to the emergency room and sang under my breath to keep him still while the nurse set an IV. There was a note about Rebecca learning to read and how she brought each new word to me like a coin and asked me to keep it safe for her. Then there was a sentence that made my hands still. She wrote that she had stared at Rebecca one afternoon in clear light and thought the child did not look much like me, that maybe it was only the way light does not fill a room the same way twice. George said the journals belonged with the other proofs. Maria nodded and slid them back into the folder. Edward shook my hand, shook George's, nodded to Maria and Robert, and took a seat. I briefed him on the last days in the simplest words I could find. Then he asked to see the capacity letters from the trust, execution, the board minutes that showed my guidance on 2 specific contracts, and the vendor emails that suggested someone was sharpening scissors at the edges. Edward read slowly and then asked 3 questions that went straight to the hinge of each matter. He said he would be willing to stand as a witness if necessary. He said that in his experience, the person who keeps to facts and refuses to be hurried often wins by making the room slow down. We watched the study clip together. No one spoke while it played. When it ended, Edward asked Maria to mark the time and date on the printout and sign beneath it that the copy we were watching was a true duplication. He asked Robert to sign as well as the person responsible for maintaining the system. He asked me to initial the chain of custody form that George printed while we spoke. Then we talked about sequence. George would send rescission letters for the vendor amendments and would copy our bank contact. Robert would maintain the copies and would install a tamper sticker on the camera rack and on the case that held the drive. Maria would inventory the items missing from the safe and would list the letters my mother had sealed. I would give Mark a full copy of the footage and of my mother's journals with a request to keep them sealed except when necessary. Edward would draft a short declaration that would accompany any set of materials we delivered to a judge if it came to that. He would include his professional opinion that the documents showed capacity and pattern. As the list grew, I felt something settle in my chest that was not anger and not sorrow. We were not guessing. We were not trading whispers for more whispers. We were building a scaffold out of facts. Robert said the gate guard had turned away a courier who claimed to have a delivery from a law firm that did not exist. He had taken down the license plate and would send it to me and to Mark. Maria said someone had called the house line twice and hung up when she answered. George said 2 small payments had been rerouted to a new account number, but that the bank had flagged them and frozen the change. I stood the chair legs scraping softly and thanked them each in turn. "Thank you for showing up," I said, and my voice held. "Thank you for bringing order." We made copies, labeled them, and set them where they would be found if needed. Edward asked if I wanted him to walk me through the next legal steps, or if it would be enough for today to know that the path existed. I placed the journals in the center drawer beside my mother's letter. The drives rested in my jacket, solid against my ribs. I stood at the window and followed the arc of a hawk until it slipped behind the trees. Then I turned back to the desk. There was a call I needed to make and a meeting I needed to set. I called the bank first. Karen Whitmore answered on the second ring and said she could see me at 9 in the morning if I brought whatever I wanted her to lock down. I told her I would arrive with documents and a short list of authorizations. Next, I reached Luis Ortega at the warehouse union office. He said he could meet late afternoon to discuss any rumors that might unsettle the crews and to put a statement in his pocket for when someone came fishing. The last call was to a supplier who had once thought he was finished until we pulled his trucks through a week of border delays. Samir said to come by his yard before lunch and that I would leave with a letter that said in plain words, I was steady and clear. When I put the phone down, my hand no longer shook. I carried the journals to the desk and laid them out in a row. Her first entry began with the day we took delivery of the second truck. She noted the weather and the exact time the driver backed it into the yard, then wrote that her son looked 10 years older and 10 years stronger in the same minute. A few pages later, she wrote about the night a storm peeled the roof off the first warehouse. We spread tarps and moved pallets by hand and slept 2 hours on canvas cots with clipboards under our heads. I turned a page and found the entry about Daniel at 6 with a fever that would not break. She wrote that I carried him into the emergency room at 2 in the morning and sang under my breath while the nurse set an IV a song I did not even know I knew until the words arrived to keep my hands from shaking. She wrote that love is not loud when it is doing its best work. Near the back of the first journal, she recorded the day Rebecca brought her first chapter book to the kitchen table and sounded out a sentence, then another, then looked up with the kind of pride that makes a room larger. The year on the cover was the year we moved from ledgers to software and from rented yard space to our own gate with our name welded into the iron. She wrote that the name on the gate matters only if it stands for something inside. She wrote that a man can be measured by whether he shows up when the forklift will not start, and when the vendor is late, and when the storm comes too early. She wrote that I kept showing up. Halfway through that book, she made a note that stopped me. She wrote that she had watched Rebecca in clear afternoon light while they folded towels and thought the girl did not look like me much that day, that perhaps it was only the way the light plays tricks, then hamama, that love does not keep a scale for features. Maria tapped on the door frame and asked if I needed anything. I told her I was fine and asked if she had eaten. She glanced at the pages and said my mother had been a fierce archivist of small truths. I said that small truths were the kind that survive the longest. The third journal began with a list of names from lenders and vendors, and a note about the day Linda discovered a world of lunches and luncheons, and began to collect them the way some people collect china patterns. My mother did not write unkindly. She wrote that success brings a bouquet of invitations and that a wise wife collects only the ones that smell like work and community, not the ones that smell like vanity. She wrote that she hoped Linda would find the difference. A few pages later, there was an entry about me missing a banquet because a truck had snapped a drive shaft on I-35, and I had promised a driver I would not leave him on the shoulder. She wrote that a man belongs where he promises to be. I made a list in my notebook of dates and subjects that would matter to anyone who needed to know that I had been present and clear when the company made its hardest turns. Storm, expansion, refinancing. The warehouse fire that we had contained before the city arrived, not because we were heroes, but because the nearest hydrant was buried under a hedge, and we had dug for it with our hands. My mother had written that story with humor and the exact location of the hedge on the north fence line. It was the kind of detail that makes men stop arguing and start listening. I considered the sealed letter again, the one Maria had found dropped by the linen closet. I slid the drawer open and looked at my name on the envelope. I told myself to wait. There are doors you open when you can hold yourself steady on both feet. Work steadied me. I carried the journals to the scanner in the alcove by the hall and made clean copies, one set for Mark, one for the safe one to keep with me until this storm finished with me. I labeled each file with dates and a calm name that would make sense to a stranger. Evidence is easier to ignore when it hides behind clever labels. I would not give the future that excuse. When the scans finished, I placed the originals back in the folder and took them downstairs to the security room. Robert had already added tamper tape to the rack and logged the last backup. I slid the folder into a locked cabinet and wrote the time and my initials in the logbook. Back in the study, I called Mark and told him what I had found and what I had copied. I did not mention the sentence about Rebecca. He said to bring the set to his office in the morning and that he would hold them under seal unless we needed to pull a line into daylight. He reminded me to eat. The pecans shivered in a light wind, and the sun moved like a slow boat across the yard toward the place where the land drops and the road curves out of sight. I thought of Karen at the bank, and Luis at the Union Hall, and Samir at his yard men and women who would not let rumor be the only voice in the room. I thought of my mother writing that a name should stand for something outside the gate. I thought of my own name and found that it still did. I closed the last journal and ran my hand over the worn cover as if I were smoothing my mother's hair. The room held me upright without effort. I stood and locked the drawer and put the keys in my pocket with the drives and the list of meetings. There was still light enough to make the trip to Samir's yard and then across town to the bank before dusk laid its hand on the city. I picked up my jacket, felt the small hard shapes against my ribs, and walked down the hall. On the way out, I paused at the photo of my mother under the pecan tree. Her smile looked like someone who trusted the next hour to do what the last one could not. I stepped into the cooler air and pulled the door closed behind me, the click neat and final. The path to the truck felt shorter than it had in the morning. I started the engine and let it settle into a low idle while I checked the list again. The day still had room in it, and for the first time in a long time I felt ready to use it. I drove to the yard first, then turned south toward the tower on Stemmons, where our name still ran in steel letters along the glass. An email from Daniel's assistant had arrived while I was on the road. Subject line: family discussion location, 10th floor conference room time in 20 minutes. I parked in my old spot. Inside, the receptionist recognized me. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," she said. "Then they are waiting in the glass room." I thanked her and pressed the button with a hand that had loaded pallets in the dark more times than I could count. The doors opened to the hallway that smelled like toner and carpet glue. Daniel stood at the head of the table. Linda sat to his right, tailored and rigid hands folded over a leather pad. Rebecca sat on the far side, posture, straight gaze steady but distant. A man in a gray suit with a thin tie sat with them. Linda introduced him without rising. "This is Mr. Holloway," she said. "He will advise on the paperwork." Daniel gestured to a stack of documents. "Transfer of executive authority," he said, and pushed the top set toward the empty chair nearest him. He added that the papers would clarify ownership structure, establish him as interim chief executive, and avoid what he called operational confusion, while longer-term decisions were finalized. I took the chair at the end near the windows. I rested my hands on the table and let my breath slow. Daniel said, "Sign them, Dad, and save us time." Linda said, "Sign Thomas. You are past your time, everyone knows it." Rebecca spoke like a lawyer. For the sake of stability, she said the family should present a united front. Investors get nervous when there is uncertainty at the top. Mr. Holloway slid a pen across the table. He said the documents had been prepared to be as painless as possible, that I would retain a consulting title and a stipend commensurate with my years of service. I asked if he had reviewed our corporate charter. He said he had. I asked if he had reviewed our last board minutes. He said he had in summary. I asked if he had seen any medical documentation that suggested I lacked capacity. He said that family statements had raised concern. Daniel leaned forward. "Do not make this theatrical," he said. "You can either be remembered as a man who knew when to pass the torch, or as someone who had it pried from his fingers." I looked at my son and felt the old ache and the new steel sit down together in my chest. "You want me to end my work with a pen stroke," I said. "You want to replace a lifetime with your signature and a press release." I shook my head. "No." Linda exhaled. "Enough," she said. "The company cannot wait for your pride to loosen. Sign." "If you decline," Mr. Holloway said, "the family will be forced to petition the court for relief." He said words like temporary and protective and fiduciary duty. I let the silence expand until the room grew uncomfortable. Then I faced them again and leveled my voice. "If you want the truth," I said, "I will show you the truth." The door opened behind me and Mark stepped in, carrying a thick folder and a slim black case. He nodded to each person at the table, then set the folder on the polished wood. "This is a family meeting," Daniel said. "We did not invite counsel." "You did," Mark said. "You invited yours." He tipped his chin at Mr. Holloway, then sat beside me and opened the folder. He slid a single page to the center of the table. It was the certificate of trust, the top line my name, the next line the name of the living trust we had executed last year. The following lines, the list of assets transferred under that instrument. Linda looked at it with a blank face. Mr. Holloway began to read. Mark placed the slim case beside the folder and folded his hands. He said we could spend the morning arguing in small circles, or we could organize ourselves like adults and go through the facts in an order that does not waste time. He said he would begin with governing documents and capacity, then move to chain of custody for certain recordings, and then address any questions about financial anomalies that had been attempted and blocked. "You think a piece of paper changes what is happening," Daniel said. "You think you can hide behind a lawyer and a binder." I let his words pass like a gust of hot wind. Mark did not look at Daniel. He looked at the lawyer. "Mr. Holloway," he said, "you will want to pay attention to the dates on the capacity evaluations and the fact that the certificate is already on file with the bank and the registrar. Any petition you contemplate will have to climb a very steep hill." Rebecca spoke softer than before. "There are rumors," she said. "People are worried about stability. We cannot ignore that. Stability is not achieved by breaking what works," Mark said. "It is achieved by proving it is still working. We have 24 months of minutes and decisions that make that point cleanly." He slid a second packet toward the center, a stack marked by tabs. "This is theater," Linda said. "The company needs fresh energy. My husband is tired." Mark kept his eyes on Mr. Holloway. "Your client may have other ambitions," he said, "but she does not have the authority she imagines." He opened the black case and removed a small drive, then set it on the table. I looked at each of them in turn. The table held the weight of paper that I had signed when I was not under a roof tilted by accusation. I said again, calm and level, "If you want the truth, we can start now." Mark lifted the first page and the room went quiet. "We begin with the trust," he said, and he laid the document flat so every hand at the table could reach it if it needed to. Mark began with the certificate itself. He said the living trust had been executed last year with my full capacity verified in writing by my primary physician and by a neurologist, that the shares of Miller Freight and the Preston Hollow House had been retitled into the trust, and that banking and registrar filings had been completed the same week. He said successor trustees had been named, and that neither Linda nor Daniel appeared on that list. Mr. Holloway asked if the bank acknowledgments were on file. Mark placed 2 letters in front of him, with blue stamps from institutions that did not like to be wrong. He asked whether the signing had been recorded. Mark nodded and said a short video existed for that day, made not for show, but to give a judge a clear window if one was ever needed. Daniel said a trust was paper, and paper was only as strong as the person holding it. He said markets changed and boards changed, and that if the family and senior staff agreed that leadership needed to shift, it would. "There is a second category of documents," Mark said. "These speak to conduct in the days after the funeral." He tapped the small drive beside his folder and asked if the room objected to a short playback. He plugged the drive into the screen hub, and the study appeared on the wall. Linda stepped through the doorway with a scarf wrapped around her hair. Daniel followed with a duffel. The 2 of them crossed to the desk. The painting lifted. The safe opened. The cedar box and velvet pouch moved from the safe into the bag. Papers were rifled and some returned in a hurry. A second clip showed the hall outside the linen closet safe. When the screen went black, Daniel said the recording lacked context. He said they had been safeguarding family items until proper inventory could be made. Linda said she did not recall the exact sequence, and that grief distorts memory. Her voice was even and careful, the same voice she used for charity luncheons and difficult caterers. Mark did not argue. He said chain of custody on the footage was documented, that the original files remained on the home system, and that mirror copies were kept off-site. He said a sworn declaration from Maria would accompany the footage, and that Robert, as the property manager, would attest to the integrity of the system. The door opened, and Edward Hayes stepped in with the quiet authority of a man who has spent years telling rooms to slow down. Mark handed him the capacity letters, the certificate, and the bank acknowledgments. Edward read without hurry. He placed the papers back on the table and said the structure was sound and the evidence of capacity was the kind that survives review. He added that any contest would require more than rumor, and that the theft footage would make claims of good faith difficult to sustain. Daniel stared at him and then at me. He said the company could not be run by a man clinging to the past. He said shareholders would not tolerate drift. Mark closed the folder gently and let his hand rest on it. He said there was one additional item that did not bear on corporate control but would affect how certain communications should be handled. He said that in the course of updating life insurance 2 years ago, I had consented to a routine screening that included a standard panel and a voluntary genetic comparison. He said that the initial comparison between my profile and Rebecca's did not produce a conventional match, that the result suggested a non-parental relationship, and that the testing at that time had been preliminary. He said no conclusion had been drawn, and no further testing had been pursued. He added that the information had remained sealed and would remain sealed unless it became necessary to explain conflicts of interest in internal statements. The room went very still. Linda's fingers lifted from the leather pad as if the surface had become hot. Rebecca's eyes widened and then dropped to her lap. She did not look at me. She did not look at anyone. Mark said again that the result was not final. He said it was not a conclusion. He said it was only a data point that explained why certain stories might have begun to travel inside the family, and why care would be taken with what was said about me in public. He said we were not making accusations, and that we would not be drawn into that conversation here. Linda found her voice. She said this was irrelevant and cruel. She said Mark was using insinuation to distract from the point of the meeting. Mark did not move his hand from the folder. He said again that corporate control was governed by the trust and by the board minutes. He looked to Edward. I felt my heart beating in my throat. I did not speak. There was nothing I could add that would make the papers more true or the images less clear. I let the silence sit with us. Mr. Holloway cleared his throat and asked to review the trust instrument from the beginning. He asked for copies of the capacity letters for his file. Mark said he would provide certified copies by afternoon. He asked whether we intended to seek an injunction against further interference. Edward said that would depend on the next 24 hours and on any continued attempts to alter vendor arrangements or to misrepresent executive authority. He said a letter would go out today to counsel and to the bank. Daniel said we were making a mistake that would cost the company its chance to evolve. He said that innovation does not wait. Edward said innovation that begins with theft and falsehood is not innovation, it is vandalism with a business plan. Rebecca stood without looking at me and said she needed air. She left the room. Linda stared at the sealed envelope as if it might change its mind if she willed it hard enough. Daniel sat his foot shaking under the table in a rhythm that had annoyed me since he was a teenager. Mark closed the black case and said that we had accomplished what we came to do. He said the company remained under the trust. He said unauthorized amendments had been frozen and would be rescinded. He said any further false public statements about my capacity would be answered with documentation and, if necessary, with action. He looked at me and then at the door where Rebecca had gone. No one moved. Outside, a siren leaned and faded on the freeway. Inside, the weight of paper and the memory of a small screen held the room in a quiet that felt like the only possible ending for that hour. Mark gathered the copies into a neat stack and slid them back into the folder. He said we would circulate certified sets before close of business, and that counsel could contact him directly for further discussion. He rose. I stood with him. No one reached for the pen that had been slid toward me at the beginning. No one spoke as we walked to the door. In the hallway, the carpet muffled our steps. Mark handed me the drive and the sealed envelope to place in my jacket, and I did. We did not speak until the elevator doors opened and closed, and the floor number began to blink upward, then downward, then steadied. The elevator doors slid open, and Mark and I stepped into the lobby. Before we reached the glass doors, my phone rang with a number from the county. Sheriff Williams said his office had questions about attempted vendor changes and a pair of shell accounts flagged by the bank, and he asked if I could come in to provide a statement and any documentation I believed relevant. I said I would be there within the hour. At the sheriff's office, a deputy led us to a conference room. Sheriff Williams thanked me for coming, then asked me to walk him through the trust structure and the timeline on the vendor anomalies. When we finished, the sheriff asked to see the rescission letters George had queued and the emails Marisol had flagged. Mark handed him a slim folder and said more would arrive by courier before noon. The sheriff said his office had already obtained bank records for 2 accounts opened under company-sounding names that were not ours. Deposits had arrived in small amounts, timed to coincide with the rerouted payments. He said a search warrant had been executed and evidence seized. He added that communications involving Linda had been preserved under a judicial order and that messages suggested she had encouraged Daniel to move quickly, that delay would only make it harder to take control. For now, she was listed as a person of interest, not yet charged. I signed a statement and passed him a copy of the footage from the study and the hallway safe. He asked if I was willing to make a brief comment in the hall acknowledging cooperation. I said I would stand beside him while he did his job, and that would be comment enough. The sheriff faced the cameras and read from a simple page. He said his office had opened an investigation into alleged financial misconduct involving shell accounts and attempted contract interference at Miller Freight, that no one had been charged, that evidence was being reviewed, and that his office would have no further comment until facts allowed it. As Mark and I stepped into the sunlight, John Stevens had posted a new story. Anonymous sources within the company. A personal relationship between Linda and David Collins that predated his promotion. Travel receipts that matched meetings, a lease for an apartment near the Trinity, where David's name appeared beside a shell company Linda had used to pay a decorator. The piece drew a line from intimacy to influence to intent. I stood on the sidewalk and felt nothing for a long breath, then a tightness that was not surprise and not relief. My attorney's phone rang. He said Linda and Daniel had arrived at the sheriff's office with counsel. He said they were being asked to make statements. He said we could wait or leave. I stayed. Rebecca arrived alone. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she said my name in a voice that belonged to the child who had once brought me new words like coins. She asked if any of this could be stopped. I told her I would not steer what the law had finally begun to drive. A deputy opened a door and called Linda's name. She went in with a man I did not recognize. Eyes high, gait steady, the posture of a woman who still believes in her ability to shape a room. After a long spell, the door opened and Linda's words cracked and caught. She stepped into the hallway and saw me, and something in her face broke. She looked at me as if I were the only witness required. She said she was sorry. She said the stories I had just read were true in the ways that mattered, and false in the ways that would tempt me to look for malice instead of weakness. She said that what began as a confidant had turned into an affair years ago, and that she had told herself it would never touch the company because she would never let it, and then it had because things we swear are contained learn how to leak. Rebecca asked who David Collins was to her. Linda closed her eyes and opened them, and the gap between felt like years. She said David was the man she turned to when she felt invisible. She said she had not meant to let the lines tangle, but they had. She said she had fought for years to keep a fact buried because she believed the world could go on without it. Rebecca asked if the lab note Mark had mentioned in the conference room was the truth. Linda's hand lifted and fell. Then she said, "Rebecca was not my daughter." She said Rebecca was David's. Rebecca staggered. She caught herself on the chair back and stared at her mother. She asked how long Linda had known. Linda said she had suspected since the first months and had convinced herself suspicion was a kind of illness that could be cured by love. She said she told no one, and then she told David years later, and then wished she had kept the first promise. Rebecca said that her whole life had been turned into a performance scripted by someone else. She said that she had defended her brother and her mother against me because that was the pattern she had been handed, not because she had examined the fabric. She said that when she looked in the mirror this morning, she had not known whose face she was wearing. She told Linda that she had made her into a lie and then expected her to live it with thanks. Daniel came through another door with his lawyer and stopped when he saw our faces. Linda tried to speak to him, but he held up a hand and shook his head. Sheriff Williams said his office was pursuing charges related to the shell accounts and the attempted vendor reroutes. He said Daniel would be contacted through counsel. He said that Linda's communications were part of the record. Rebecca sank into a chair and covered her face. Linda stood very still. Mark remained a quiet wall at my side. I watched the pieces of a story rearrange themselves into something that looked like the truth. I said I did not need revenge. Justice and the slow grind of consequence had already begun their work. I said I would cooperate with the law and keep the company steady and leave the rest to the rooms where it belonged. The sheriff nodded once. He said a detective would be in touch. He thanked me for coming and then turned to speak with Linda's counsel. We walked out into late afternoon light. Mark asked if I needed a ride or a moment. I told him I had my truck and more than a moment, and he smiled like a man who knows when to stop asking. I unlocked the door and sat with my hands on the wheel. My phone buzzed with messages I did not open. I started the engine and let it idle until the noise in my head softened into something that sounded like the road. Spring slid into summer, and the company found its rhythm again. The law did its work while I did mine. We structured a $500 million endowment for Texas students who could not see a way past the first tuition bill. Luis from the union pledged apprenticeships for young people who wanted a skilled trade instead of a classroom. We called it the Helen Miller Scholarship Fund, because sometimes the plainest name carries the deepest promise. Folding chairs filled with students, parents, teachers, truckers still in their work boots, and a row of women from the food pantry who had once watched my mother label boxes with a marker and a smile. When they called my name, I walked to the lectern and looked out at the faces. I said we had built this fund to open doors that money liked to close. I said that the scholarships would go to first-generation college students and to men and women who wanted to learn a trade that would feed a family and build a community. I said that every dollar came with a promise to serve the towns that raised us, not the headlines that forget us. Legacy does not live in the money. It should mean a wider welcome and a warmer room. I saw a boy in the third row squeeze his mother's shoulder so hard she laughed and cried at the same time. We called 10 students to the stage for the first awards. I shook their hands and felt their futures jump from palm to palm like a live wire that does not burn only lights. After the program, cameras crowded and microphones leaned. Reporters asked about the investigation and about the company and about whether an old man could still read the road. I said the law was doing what the law does, and the company was doing what it was built to do, and that I had never been more certain about either. John Stevens asked if I had a message for families who were breaking in public the way mine had. I looked past the cameras at the students posing with their certificates, and I said that truth finds its way to daylight, and that humility is the only bridge that holds when the water rises. Articles followed that sounded like correction without apology. They called the fund ambitious and well-designed. They said the endowment from a freight fortune was the rare story that did not end in a yacht, but in 100 front doors swinging open at once. They acknowledged the investigation and then shifted to the kids, because in the end, people would rather read about a ladder than a fall. The calls changed. The whispers stopped. Boardrooms that had turned stiff now felt easy again. I slept for the first time in months without waking to the sound of a door slamming in my chest. One evening after the dust of the launch settled, I drove back to Cedar Ridge in the blue hour when the pecans turned to black lace against the western sky. Maria left a plate of supper on the counter, with a note that told me to eat before it went cold. I finished it, standing with the back door open and the crickets starting up. Then I went to the study and opened the center drawer and took out the 3 journals and the envelope we had found dropped by the linen closet. The tape lifted clean. Inside was a single sheet, my name at the top in my mother's hand. I read it in the chair that still held the shape of the boy I had been when I first sat in it. She had written that she was proud of the stubborn way I held a promise. She had written that love is not a ledger because it cannot be balanced and should not be. She wrote that if a day ever came when my house felt empty, I should find a way to fill another house that had no one to sit at its table. She wrote that grief is work and that I should not pretend it is anything else. She did not mention names or suspicions or the kind of facts that make lawyers line up files in neat rows. She wrote like a mother who understood that life sorts facts and then asks for mercy anyway. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope and slid it into the journal where it belonged. I sat with the quiet until it turned from empty to full. Out in the hall, the clock ticked like a truck's turn signal at a stoplight in a sleeping town. The house did not feel like a museum anymore. It felt like a room with its lights on, where someone might come in and ask for water and a story before bed. Rebecca called the next day and asked to meet in a place with no microphones. We sat on a bench in the arboretum and watched kids throw bread at ducks that did not need it. She said she wanted to know me without scripts. I said the door was open and would stay open. We did not talk about news. We talked about the way jasmine smells in June and the way a piano can make a room less afraid. I did not ask for more than that. Sometimes the beginning of repair is the promise that there is nothing to repair that will hurry. As the months rounded the corner into fall, the fund sent out its first checks. The company hit its targets, and the sheriff made his announcements in the careful way men do when they respect both truth and the people it breaks. I learned to measure days by what I could give them rather than what they had taken. In the mornings, I walked the property lines with Robert and listened to the hawks. In the afternoons, I visited the warehouse and watched forklifts dance like heavy ballerinas between shelves. In the evenings, I read a few pages from my mother's books and felt her hand on my shoulder without needing to see it. I am an old man by some measures and a working man by others. I have seen roads wash out and be rebuilt, and I have learned that the lane you choose says as much about who you are as where you arrive. So I will leave you with what the years have taught me. Do not let greed and betrayal cloud justice. Justice will find its way to the light. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that truth still stands up when it is asked to. Like the video, leave your thoughts and subscribe so you can walk with me through the next road the day lays down.